Hey guys, and welcome back to a brand new video. Now, in the last video, we completed essentially the entirety of our game, but at the moment, the game still feels a little bit bland. It seems a little bit boring, and we want to spice it up. So from now on, what we're going to be focusing on is we're essentially going to be taking our game and we're going to be polishing it so that it feels a bit more lively. We're going to add some audio in it, and so on and so forth. Okay? So the first thing that I want to do is I want to quickly jump on over to my gameplay scene, and I want to add some background audio to this, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and go over into my resources folder, and in audio, I have some of these audio sounds. Now over here, I want to play this swamp sound. You can double click it, and you can preview it in VLC, or let's go ahead and close VLC. We can also preview it here in the bottom right. Now, I'm not great into music, but this was just something that I found on the internet, which is free to use, so feel free to create your own music if you're into that stuff, or just go ahead and use this to follow along and learn how everything is done here. So adding audio in a game is relatively easy, okay? What we need to do is, in order to add audio into our game, we need an audio source, okay? So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go in my game manager, and I'm going to do add component, and I'm going to search for audio source, okay? I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and it is going to add this component called audio source. Now, the audio source is essentially looking for an audio clip. So if I go ahead and drag and drop my swamp audio file over here, and if I now hit play, it seems to be working like the way I want. Now, one more thing that we want to really quickly do is over here, since I want this audio to keep looping, I can do this checkbox, and over here we have a bunch of essentially fine-tuning controls such as volume, pitch, so on and so forth. So feel free to kind of fool around with those to get the right feel for the game. But those are there, but we will not necessarily be touching those, but you can imagine that these are relatively straightforward. Okay. Now, similar to the audio in this scene, I also want to add audio to my main menu scene. I say that because when I hit play here, and when our game ends, let's see, when I increase the speed, and now when I go to the main menu, there is no audio here. If I start my game again, it's going to fire up that audio again. So I want to go ahead and add audio into my main menu as well. So I can really quickly go ahead and go on to my main menu. I can save my changes here, and I can similarly add an audio source in this scene also. Okay, so just like how we did it in the game scene, we could just as easily come here, we could add an audio source here, and go ahead and do that, and I will quickly show you a problem that we will come into. So going over here, this is the audio file that I want to essentially play, and I want to go ahead and drag and drop that over here into my audio source, and I'm going to go ahead and make this volume a little bit low, and if I hit play now, you notice how the audio is playing. I'm going to go ahead and reduce the volume a little bit more just so that you can hear me over it. Okay, so we know that the audio is playing. If I now hit play though, notice how there is a jarring change between that background and this one, okay? And what we want to do is essentially when we load the new scene, I want the background disco music to keep on playing, okay? I don't want that to essentially get destroyed. And in order to do that, we're going to have to do something a little bit different. The reason why currently the audio does not persist between scenes is because this main camera, and therefore this audio listener, only exists in this scene, and vice versa for the gameplay scene. So whenever we switch between these scenes, that information for the audio source is essentially lost. So what we need to do is we need to programmatically find a way to make sure that we do not destroy the background audio while we're transitioning from one scene to the other. Now, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to go ahead and head on over to my scripts folder, and I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'll call this music. And just for the sake of good practice, what I'm going to do is in my hierarchy, I'm going to create a new empty object, So right click, create empty. I'm going to go ahead and set this to the center, not that it matters because it's going to be an empty game object. I'm going to go ahead and call this music, okay? Now, and what I'll do is I'll go ahead and throw this music script onto this game object. I'm also going to go ahead and remove my audio source over here, and I'm going to go ahead and throw that onto my music game object. Now, the reason why we're doing this is we could have just as easily thrown the music script right now onto our camera, and that would have worked as well. But the reason why we're doing this is when you're building more complex games, and if if you've got multiple scenes, if you've got some sort of, functionality where you need to be tweaking the background music, you need to turn it off, you need to pause it, you need to resume it, so on and so forth. In terms of multi-scene audio, then usually more complex games will have a custom sort of an audio or some sort of audio manager or a music manager. So that is essentially what this music game object is going to be. And just to have all of our music and audio related stuff in a concise place, that's how we're going to do it. I'm going to go ahead and go in my audio folder again, and I'm going to drag and drop this file here. Now, it currently doesn't change anything. We still need to figure out how to make this music persist. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in my scripts, and we'll fire up this music script. Now, I want to remind you that this music script is on this music game object, okay? So when I go in this script on the start function, if I do something like this, if I say don't destroy on load, and I say this dot game object, essentially what I'm telling Unity is, hey, do not destroy this game object, okay? That's essentially what I am telling it. So if I save now, and if I switch over onto Unity, let's see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and make this volume a little bit more bearable, and let's hit play. If I now switch over, notice how that audio continues to persist. I'm going to go ahead and mute the audio here just so that I can talk. And notice over here in the scene hierarchy, you see the sample scene stuff that we worked on, but you also see the don't destroy on load music. Now, what I want to point out to you here though is that when the game finishes and when I go back into my main menu, you'll notice how since the scene started again, that scene created a second music game object. So we hadn't destroyed the last one, and now a new scene started, and now we have a second audio playing essentially. So if I unmute now, now you essentially have two background audios running at the same time. And if we persist just like it is, every time we come back to our main menu, we will have a new music object, and we will have 3, 4, 5, 6 different audios running at the same time, which we don't want. So essentially what we want to do is every time that this scene starts, we want to make sure that, hey, only one of these is running, okay? And essentially what this is it keeps stacking these up as essentially like an array, and what we can do is we can say, hey, find all of the game objects in this scene called music and just keep one, okay? And the way we're going to do that in code is what we will look at now. So the way we can do this is we can say game objects, and we can create an array of game objects because there is a possibility that there are going to be multiple game objects, and we'll call this game object, and we'll say game object dot find game objects with tag, okay? So we're looking for game objects with tag, and we have to give it a tag, and the tag that we will give this is music, okay? All of this is lowercase. So essentially what we're doing is we're looking for all game objects with the tag music, and we're storing it in this variable, and this is going to be an array of all game objects with this tag, okay? We don't have this tag yet, so we are going to initialize that in just a second. Now, what we can do is, now that we have all of these music game objects, we can iterate over them, and we can say, hey, if, and let's call this music game objects, okay? And what we can say is music game objects dot length. So .length of an array essentially gives us the size, i.e. how many elements there are. So we want there to be only one game object that is with the tag music on at any point in time. So what we can say is if the length of this music game object array is greater than 1, it means that we have repeat multiple copies of music. So we want to essentially destroy them. So we can do simply destroy this game object. And what this is doing is essentially it's every music game object is going to have this music script, and at the start it's going to iterate over and go ahead and destroy all of them which are actually in access. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. I'm going to save, and if I now switch on over back to Unity, what we need to do is we need to give this music game object a tag. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to do add tag, and I'm going to try and make sure that the tag that I add is essentially the same as the one that we just named in our script. So I'm going to call this music, all lowercase. I'm going to go here on my music game object and give it the music tag. Okay. Now, if I quickly just save, and if I hit play now, let's see what happens. Okay, so we have our audio file currently playing, right? You can see here, don't destroy on load music. It continues to persist through into the next scene. And let's wait for this to finish. And now I'm going to go back into my main menu. I'm going to mute it now, and notice how over here there's only one music object. So whereas previously it kept creating more and more music objects, now we just have one, and we're making sure that the first one is the one that is essentially being persisted throughout. Okay, so that's really cool. Our game now has audio, and that's awesome. Okay, so now that our audio, the background music audio is looking good, I want to have some feedback for every time we smash a zombie. Okay, so I'm going to switch on back into our scene. Okay. And over here, every time we smash a zombie, we want some audio. Now, the way we're going to do this is essentially switching over onto our code. If I go on player input, if you remember, this is the part where we were killing the enemy. And essentially, this is the part where we need to play the smash audio, okay? So, what we're going to do is we're going to, if I scroll over here in my audio, notice how I have a bunch of these smash sounds. And they all sound a little bit different, and I have 4 of them just for variety so that it's not the same smashing sound every single time. And we're going to kind of randomize it just so that it feels different every single time. So what I can do is I can come here at the top of my player input script, and I can create a public array of audio clips. Okay, so public array audio clips, and we'll call this smash sounds. Okay, I'm going to save it. I'm going to give Unity a second to essentially refresh, and we can then go ahead and add these in the inspector. So now if I save here, and if I switch on over to Unity, if I go on over to my game manager, and inside the player input, you notice how there is this array of smash sounds. And I can go ahead and drag and drop my smash sounds one by one, and like so. Okay, so now that we have our audio clips here, we can access them in code. Now, in order to play an audio source, what we also need is essentially an audio source, okay? So what we can do is we can say audio source, and we'll call this audio source, okay? Now, there's a couple of different ways that we could do it. If you remember, we added an audio source over here, and essentially we need a reference to this audio source in our code. So we can say, hey, let's make this public, and if I save it now, if I switch on over, and once Unity loads, notice how the player input is now looking for an audio source, and I can drag this audio source and I can put it in here, and now I have reference to this audio source. That's one way of doing it. I really quickly wanted to show you a different way of doing it. and that is if I go ahead and remove this as public, so essentially it becomes private by default, what I can do is I can search for this audio source component on the same game object here in the start. Okay, so if you remember, start runs at the time when this scene will essentially start, and this script will start working, and start will run one time. So what I can say is I can say audio source equals get component of type audio source. Okay, and what this line of code does is essentially at the start, when this function is running, our code, our script will loop through all of these components. So it will look through transform, it will look through game manager, it will look through player input, and then it will find audio source and it will say, hey, this is the audio source that you were looking for, and here it is. So that is essentially just the same way of getting reference to your audio source. Okay, so now we have a reference to our audio source and we can use it to play our sounds here. Okay, so the way we can play an audio clip using our audio source is audio source dot play one shot. Okay, and essentially it just plays one audio clip. And just to test it, what we can do is we can use the first smash sound here. So I can say play smash sounds dot 0, so that is the first element in our smash sounds array, comma, it requires a volume. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give this 0.5f because I don't want it to be too loud, and we can tweak this around later. So if I save now and if I switch back, every time I smash an enemy, it's going to play that smash sound. Okay, so let's hit play here. Oh, and let me go ahead and unmute this audio. So you notice how it's working. Now, of course, it's just playing the first audio here. So we can quickly randomize that, and that's something that we've done before as well. So I want to quickly come over here and I want to randomize it. So what I can do is I want to play smash sounds, and I want to play a random clip from this array. And I can do this by saying random.range, so random.range, and I'm going to give it 0, comma, and we need to give it which indexes are eligible. So generate a random number between 0 and essentially what, and in this case I'm going to give it smash sounds dot length. Okay, so let's see what this is going to do. This line here is essentially going to generate a random integer between 0 and the length of this smash sounds array, which is 4, not including 4. Okay, so every time we use random.range with integer values, then it does not include this last topmost value. Okay, so it does 0, 1, 2, and 3. So essentially it generates a random number between 0, 1, 2, and 3, and that corresponds to 0 here, 1 here, 2 here, and 3 here. Okay, so this is going to randomly generate and essentially play that smash sound. So if I save now, if I give you the effect tool mode, and if I switch on over and hit play, let's see what happens. And I will see you in the next video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. Now our game is coming along just awesome, and in the last couple of videos we've pretty much sort of wrapped up the core game, but we've been focusing on polish, and we've got audio now, and we've got some sound for smashing our zombies, and now we want to add a little bit more life to it, and we're going to add some blood splashing, and in general just some screen shaking and so on and so forth, so that, you know, actually smashing the zombie feels really just fun and invigorating, essentially. So the way we're going to do this is if you go over to your sprites folder, there is this sprite sheet here of blood splatter, and currently it's set to texture type default. Now I would hope that you have already set this to essentially sprite 2D and UI, but if you haven't, you want to go ahead and do that right now. So you click on this button here and you scroll down and hit the apply button. Now, the way you know that this has changed to this sprite 2D and UI is that this is essentially that the background color is now transparent, and you've also got this great little toggle button. So what this does is essentially changes the type of the sprite, but unlike all of these other sprites that we've been using, this sprite actually contains a bunch of smaller sprites in it, and we want to be able to splice them, okay? So the way we're going to do this is over here on the right hand side, you go on sprite mode, and instead of saying single, you can hit multiple, okay? And we'll leave everything to default, and if I hit the apply button, let's see what happens, essentially, okay? Now if I go here and click on this little play icon, you can see how Unity has already spliced up all of our sprites, and these are all the different levels or different steps that our animation will go in. A little bit more information about how this is happening is, if I click here on the sprite editor, then you'll notice that it's essentially broken down all of these little phases based on the amount of white spaces, and it's done that equally, and that's essentially just how in general sprites are. A sprite sheet, Unity is smart enough to know essentially how to do that. Also, we've also been by default setting 100 pixels per unit, so it's creating these 100 pixel by 100 pixel boxes, and it's also just slicing them up nice and well. Now, if for example our automatic slicing was not good enough for whatever reason, then this is where you would edit it and alter it and so on and so forth. And this is just for reference, but we're pretty happy with the result that we got. So I'm gonna go ahead and just undo those changes, and now we've got this essentially nice little thing going. Now we need to figure out, hey, how can we actually display this in the game? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this first one, I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop all of these in my hierarchy, okay? As soon as I do that, notice how it's asking me to name and save a file, and what's happening is when we drag and drop like so, it's essentially creating a brand new animation, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and call this Smash, I don't know. Let's call it Smash. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And once I hit save, essentially, it will do something like so. So let's look at what we got, essentially. Well, first of all, it's instantiated a game object, here it seems, in the scene view. So if I switch over to my scene view, and if I click on it, it seems to be here. What it's also done is it's gone ahead and added a component called the animator. And if I double click here, then it's showing me that it's created this smash animation, okay? So let's see what happens if I hit play in the game right now. I'm gonna go ahead and mute the game, and let's see what happens. Okay, so we're not seeing anything. If I switch back to my animator, I'm seeing that the smash animation is running, and I'm still not seeing anything. So let's switch over to the scene view, and let's look for it, and maybe let's try setting the order in layer to 5. And boom, there we go. Now we are seeing this animation. Okay. You're probably a little bit confused as to what just happened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete this here, and we'll do this all over again. Just a different way, just so that we can see what's actually happening. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to right click, create a new empty game object, and let's call this blood effect, okay? Now, the thing is, to create that splash effect that we saw, essentially what we want to do is we want to create an animation, okay? So let's go on this blood effect game object, and let's add a component called an animator. Okay, not an animation, but an animator, okay? And an animator is essentially a game component which you will add on to different things, and you can give it essentially animations which the animator will then decide which animation to run when. So essentially, if you have, for example, a game with a character in it, and you have idle animation and you have a walk animation, then essentially you will have an animator on your character, and in that animator you will have the information for when to switch from walk to idle and so on and so forth. Okay, so now we have created an animator. Now, the animator essentially is looking for an animator controller. The animator controller, like I said, contains the information for what information of the state that this particular game object is in, i.e. in this case, the animator is going to have the information for when to essentially run the animation. So what I can do is I can create a new controller, okay? So let's go ahead and I'm just going to go in my assets folder right now, and I'm going to right click here and I'm going to look for a new animator controller. So here we go, okay? And let's call this blood animator. Okay, and now we have an animator. I can now drag and drop this animator onto the blood effect and it will automatically attach it here. Notice like so, okay? And now if I double click on this, I have now opened my animator. Okay, now I want to say this as a side note that when we directly dragged and dropped all of those animations, and we'll look at that again in a second, we were getting all of this work done for us for free, okay? But I'm just showing you these steps so that we can really understand what exactly happened. Now inside our animator, we have a bunch of states, and we will be using these states to essentially trigger our animations, okay? So entry essentially means what is the first thing that we want to happen, essentially. And really, we're not going to be running this animation until we actually press on the screen and kill the zombie. So what we can do is we can do right click, create state, and we can say empty. And we can double click the state and we can rename it here and call it empty. Okay, I'm calling it empty because essentially this means that when the game starts, it's essentially going to be in the empty state, i.e. it's not going to be doing anything, okay? Now what we want to do is every time we have a successful smash, we want to transition into our animation, which is going to be the blood splatter animation. Now what I can do is, going back into our sprites folder, I can select all of these once again, and I can drag and drop them onto our blood effect, and I will get the same exact, essentially, menu. And let's use the same name, and we can just overwrite it, and we'll say yes here. And notice how now we get this smash animation. So essentially, this is like a state, okay? And these are all these different states, and we can decide when which state is running, okay? Now, to show you what I mean by that is if I hit play now, okay, so now that the game is running, if I switch back to the animator, you notice that the empty state is running. Also, if you're not seeing the same view as the one that I'm looking at, you can click on the blood effect so that essentially the game object is selected, and then when you go into the animator, you'll be able to see. And as you can see, we have the empty effect looping over and over and over again. What we want to do now is we can, using this knowledge, you can already imagine that whenever we have a successful hit, we want to transition from the empty state to the smash state. That will then trigger the animation for the blood splatter, and from the blood splatter, once it's happened, we want to trigger back into the empty state. So hopefully it's making a little bit more sense now than before. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the game, and just like this line here, we can make these transitions, and if I right click on empty, I can transition onto smash, and after smash, I can transition back to empty. Okay. Now that we've got these triggers, what's going to happen is if I hit play now, it's going to go into empty, it's going to run empty, and immediately it will go into smash. If I hit play now, we'll see what happens. Okay, so we were supposed to see the smash animation, and we're not really seeing that, and you're probably wondering, well, hey, what's going on? Well, if you remember, we studied the concept of essentially the orders for our sprites, and over here the order is 0. So if I just make it 5, then you'll see that smash animation that's going to be going over and over again, and of course it's over the main menu UI is overlaying that. But if I play again, and if I go here, and if I once again make the order in layer as to, let's say, 5, then you'll see it happen. So I think what we're doing is working. Okay, but now what's happening is that that same animation is looping over and over again. If I hit play again quickly just to show you, and we know it's not showing up, but it's running, it goes into empty, it plays smash, it goes into empty, it plays smash, and so on and so forth. And that's exactly what we're doing, and you can even see these transitions and these lines, you know, turning blue and then white and so on and so forth. but that is progress, okay? What we can also do is, on these lines, we can put conditions on them. So we can say, hey, only go from empty to smash when something happens, okay? Okay, so the way we're gonna do that is over here, we can click on parameters, and we can add in new parameters. So if I click on this plus sign, it gives me an option. Do you want to add a float, integer, bool, or trigger parameter? And in this case, we're going to have a trigger parameter. And we'll call this one, let's say, smashed, okay? A trigger parameter, if it's not immediately obvious, is essentially just like a trigger. So if we trigger something through code, we want this line to go through like so, okay? So these parameters we can change through our code, and that's essentially what we'll be doing. So it's going to be looping in the empty state, but what we want is as soon as we trigger this smashed parameter, we want it to play this animation, okay? If I click over here, what I can do is I can turn off has exit time, and essentially what that means is as soon as this condition is true, I want it to transition immediately, okay? So I can click over here on the plus sign, it automatically finds smashed for us because that was the only parameter that we currently had. And what it's saying is, hey, transition from empty to smash when smashed becomes activated, okay? And like I was saying before, we want to turn has exit time off, okay? What that means is, hey, even if you're halfway through empty, do not wait for empty to finish, just immediately trigger smash, okay? However, on the reverse way, right, what we want is to go from smashed to empty, we want to have that exit time because we're basically saying, hey, play the smash animation, play the whole animation, and once that animation is done, then go back to empty, okay? So hopefully that makes sense as well. Okay, so now I want to look at how essentially I can trigger this in code. Okay, so really quickly what I'm going to do is, first of all, let's just go ahead and make the order in layer to something like 3 just so that it's on top of everything. And now we'll look at how we can trigger this through code. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to Visual Studios. And over here, the place where we're going to essentially play the smash animation should be over here because this is where we were killing the zombie and this is where we were playing the smash audio, okay? Now, to keep everything neat and clean, what I can do is, what we can do is essentially we can create a new function. So we'll call this private void and we'll call this display blood effect and we'll just leave it like so. Now what we can do is essentially we can go ahead and call this function over here and that will take care of that. Now what we can do is, in order to actually trigger the animation, we need a reference to that game object in code, and we've done this before, so we'll just scroll over here and we'll declare a new public variable. So public game object, and we'll call this blood effect. Okay, let's see. All right, I'm gonna save. I'm gonna give Unity a second to compile. And when I switch back and I go on to my game manager, let's see, over here on my player input script, it's looking for a game object called blood effect. So I can go ahead and drag and drop blood effect in here. And now we have access to that game object. Okay, switching back onto my code. Now what I can do is, in order to actually play that animation, what I need to do is I need to get to the animator and I need to set the trigger. If you remember, this is a game object. On this game object is a component called animator. Inside that animator, there is this animation which is going to be triggered by this parameter. Okay, that's a mouthful, right? So there's a game object. On the game object, there is an animator. Inside this animator is where we have information for how we can trigger these animations. So to do that, what we can do is, we already have the blood effect game object. We can do something like get component, which we've done before, and I'm looking for the component of type animator. Okay, so animator. Okay, not animation, but animator. Once I have the animator, what I want to do is, inside the animator, I want to set this trigger. okay? So what I can do is dot set trigger, and it's going to be looking for the name of my trigger, okay? So over here, it's really important that the spelling of this exactly matches the spelling of this, okay? Including the lower and uppercase. So I'm gonna go here and I'm going to call this smashed just like so, okay? Now what I can do is I can save and I can switch back on over to Unity and see if everything's working like I want. Okay, so back in Unity, if I now hit play, let's see what happens. Okay, so the smash animation is playing. It's playing at the wrong position, but it's playing. It also feels a bit slow, but again, it's playing, so that's progress, right? Now, you might think, well, hey, wait a second, the smash position for... Now, you might say, wait, well, hold on a second, the blood effect is completely skewed. It's at the wrong place, and you're absolutely right about that. And it's at the wrong place because we placed it at the center. We never gave it information about where it needs to be, so we need to do that as well. So switching back onto the code, what we need to do is in this function, essentially, we need to tell Unity where you actually want to position this game object, okay? And we can do that quite easily because if you remember over here, when we actually press the button down, our left mouse button, we have that information. We have the information through input.mouse position, okay? So we can use that essentially to decide where in the world we want to make this effect happen, okay? So what we can do is let's give it a vector2 position, okay? And we will use this position to essentially set where we want to display it, okay? Now over here, obviously it's giving us an error because now it's expecting us to give it a vector2 position. So what we can do is we can do camera.main, okay, dot screen to world point input dot mouse position, and boom. Okay, so what exactly did we do here? And I need to close off this bracket. Okay, so let's just look at this line of code. What I'm saying is I'm taking the information of my mouse position and I'm converting it from screen to world point, okay? Now, let me talk to you a little bit about what's happening here. Whenever the game is playing and I click on the screen, right, there is a screen view and then there is a world view, okay? As this function goes on to say, this is a screen to world point. Now, this game object, okay, is residing in the world. And when we click on the screen, we're clicking on the screen, i.e. this is 0, 0 pixel point, and this is the width in pixels, and this is the height in pixels. So whenever I click, let's say on this point here on my screen, I'm clicking at a certain pixel position. So this is, I don't know, pixel 200 to the right and 500 units up in pixels. But I need to convert those pixels into world points, because if you remember, if I switch over here into my three-dimensional view, then these are actually game objects which are residing in the world. You remember how we talked about these transform positions X, Y, and Z, and these are not positions based on pixels, these are positions based on Unity units, okay? These are actual units, and the screen where we're clicking has pixels on it. So what we're saying is, hey, input.mouse position, right? And this is going to give us something back in pixels, and what we can do is we can convert that into world point. Remember over here, back when we were creating array, we were doing something very similar. We were using input.mouse position, but then we were doing screen point to array. Again, we had to take the screen point and we then had to convert that into array. Okay, so that's essentially what we are doing. And since we don't need the Z direction, the reason why we are using vector2.position, we could also use vector3 okay? But we don't need to since we're only building a 2D game. So essentially whatever information that this gives us, right? So if this gives us a point, let's say x comma y, oops, I did not expect that. So if this gives us, for example, let me just comment that out. If this gives us a point x comma y comma z, right? If I cast that into, even though it's a 3-dimensional point, if I cast this into a vector 2, then this just becomes x comma y, okay? And I hope that that makes sense. So essentially in this line of code, we are passing the position in world units where we want to put this blood effect happen, okay? So let's go ahead and save it. We'll switch over to Unity and we'll see if it's working the way we expect it to work. All right. Let's hit play. And it is still not working. So what's happening here? Well, let's see. Let's go back into our code. And sure enough, even though we have passed this position into our function, we are never actually setting it. So again, there's no way for Unity to know. So before we actually trigger this animation, we need to actually set it. And we can do this pretty easily. We can say blood effect dot transform dot position equals to false. Okay. Hopefully now when we save and when we switch back to it, everything should be fine. And once again, in this line, all we're saying is, hey, get the game object blood effect that we have reference to, get its transform, and set the transform's position to this position, okay? Alright, so going back to Unity, let's hit play and see if it works. And now it seems to be working, okay? It's a bit slow, it's a bit lethargic, but it's working, okay? So, first of all, what I want to do is I want to make it faster. Okay, so the way I can speed up the animation is if I click on blood effect here, if I go on my animator again, if I click on the smash animation, then I have the speed modifier. And I can essentially increase the speed to make the animation run a little bit faster. So if I make it, let's say 1.5, if I now hit play, then the animation should be 1.5x the original speed. And that looks pretty decent, okay? Let's go ahead and increase it to 2 and see what that looks like. And that feels pretty good, except for the fact that you notice how there is this small little glitch happening here where it's trying to run so quickly that it's running twice. So let's go ahead and sort that out as well. Switching back into my animator. So over here in this transition back to empty, right? Notice if I click on this transition, you'll see that as Smash is running, empty will start running towards the very end, and that last little bit of Smash will try and fit in here. Okay, we don't want that essentially, okay? So we can go ahead and we can essentially make this like so. And this is the point in the animation where the transition starts to happen, okay? And we can even move empty a little bit to the right. Okay, so that overlap between smash and empty is not going to happen anymore, and we can even make this transition a little bit more here and like so. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. That was pretty intuitive. If I now go back and if I play it again, then it should not happen. So perfect. Now this feels good, this feels fast, and this feels crisp. If I unmute it, then along with the audio, it's really feeling good. So one other thing that I noticed was that with respect to the zombies, my smash was probably a little bit too big. So I can just come here, I can look for my blood effect, and I can make it a little bit smaller. So let's just make it 0.6, and I'm just changing the scale here. If I now hit play, then hopefully it will look a little bit better. Okay, that looks good. Okay. Alright, well, now that we've got our smash animation, I want to have some sort of a screen shake. So every time when I actually smash a zombie, I want a bit of a screen shake so that I can really feel that smash, okay? And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use animations again. So just like how we added an animator onto our Smash or Blood Effect game object, we're going to do the same thing, except this time we're going to add an animator onto our camera, and we're just going to shake the camera a little bit. Okay, so the way we can do that is we can come in here, and once again in my assets hierarchy, ideally you'd want to make a new folder for all your animators, for your animations, but at the moment, since this is a small project, I'm just going to go ahead and do it over here. And let's go ahead and right click, create, and we can create a new animator controller, and we'll call this camera animator. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop this onto our camera. Okay, so like so. Notice over here it's created a new component and it's called it camera animator. If I go ahead and just to show you, if I remove this component, if I come here and if I want to add an animator component, then I can also search for here and I can look for my camera animator like so. Okay, so now I have an animator set up on my camera. If I double click it here or here, either ways, it can open up here in the animator view. Notice now this is once again empty because of course this is, this is our camera animator and not our blood splash effect animator. Okay, so at the moment it's empty. Okay, let's go ahead and create a new state and we'll call this empty. We'll go ahead and just call this idle like before, and this is just going to be the state in which the camera is going to be in the normal running of the game. And now what we want to do is we want to have an animation where it's going to transition to, that's going to shake the camera a little bit. Okay, so let's go back into our scene view, or let's go back into our game view actually, and select the camera, and now go on Windows, Animation, and let's click on Animation. Okay, when you do that, it should open something like so. Okay, what we can now do is we can click on Create, and we can create our own animation. So I'm going to go ahead and put this animation here in the Assets folder, and we'll call this Camera Shake. Okay, and we'll hit the Save button, and now you see something like so. Okay, now you're essentially seeing a timeline. Alright, so once we're here, we can essentially change the transform of the camera, and we can then play that shaking motion of the camera moving within our game. Now, what I'm going to do is let's try and say about like 5 seconds or so, and we're obviously going to speed this up, but just for reference, in fact, let's just do that like properly. So let's go ahead and let's see, 1 second in, let's move the camera to the right a little bit. Okay, now if I move it too much to the right, it's going to start showing me the green, so I don't want to go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and just move it 0.5 to the right, and 1 second later, let's move it back to 0, and another second later, let's move it back to minus 0.5, and then let's move it back to 0. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we start at 0, 0, then we move it to 0.5, we move it back, we move it to the left, and we move it back. If I were to play this now, this is what that would feel like. And that maybe feels okay. So what we can now do is if I hit unsave, then it will automatically save that. And now I can go and find this in my animator. So if I go here, notice how it's automatically giving me this camera shake. So if I were to go from idle to camera shake and back again, then you already know if I hit play now, it's always going to go from idle to camera shake. So just to get a little bit dizzy and see what that animation feels like, if I hit play now, and there we go. I think that animation feels kind of nice, right? Especially with the UI staying in place and everything, I think it looks nice. So we'll stick with that. Obviously, we still need to take care of when to trigger it, and we're going to do this very similar to what we were doing for our blood splatter. So going over here, I can go and create a new parameter. Okay, I'm going to call this a trigger, and we'll call this shake. And from idle to camera, we do not want any exit time because we want immediately snappy movement into camera shake. And once again, if I hit the plus sign, it will automatically populate it, since that's the only parameter we have in this animator. Okay, so it's going to go from idle to camera shake when shake gets triggered, and then when camera shake is over, it's essentially going to go back into idle. Notice how over here it's running camera shake 4 times, and we don't want that. I don't think so. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and cut this down until there's only one of them left here, like so. Okay, and we'll just see what that looks like, and then we'll decide what we want to do. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump back into our code and trigger this animation. Okay, jumping back into our code, we want to have this camera shake just every time when we kill our enemy. Okay, so what we can say here is, just like before, we can do camera.main, and we want to find the animator, so we can say get component. Okay, and the component we want is the animator. And what we want to do is, once we have access to our animator, we want to say set trigger, and the name of our trigger was shake. Okay, I'm going to save. I'm going to quickly make sure that I spelled this exactly the same, and notice that I didn't. So this is capital and this is lowercase, so I'm going to go ahead and change that to capital as well. I'm going to switch back to Unity. The Unity is going to compile, and once it's ready, we can test this out and see what it feels like. Okay, alright, and that is your screen shake. Now I think that this is a little bit too extreme, so we want to tone that down just a little bit. And what we can do is we can click on our camera shake animation. We can once again go in Windows, we can go in animation, and over here, if I click on my camera, then it will load my camera shake animation. If you have multiple animations, then it will show you different animations here, but that is essentially the one that we just made. And the problem that I'm having is that it's too jarring, and I think that we're moving the camera too much in between these points. I feel like the timing is nice, but we're just moving it too much. So what I want to do is, if I switch over here, I'm going to hit the record button again, and I'm going to start trying to edit this a little bit. Okay, so notice how it's moving here. What I'm going to do is, I want to move this, instead of 0.5, let's make it 0.25, okay? And then back to 0, and over here, let's make it minus 0.25, okay? And now if I unchecked record, if I go back, and let's see if that feels a little bit better. Okay, so a little bit better. Still feels a little bit too much for me though. So this is just essentially endless tweaking, and that is what game development is. I just want to make sure that all of our transitions are all right. Okay, let's go ahead and tweak it one more time. Okay, let's see animations, and I can click on the camera and it will show me this animation. And let's make it even less. So hit the record button. Do not forget to hit the record button, and we'll just make it 0.1 here. And over here, we'll make it minus a 0.1. I will uncheck record, and should be good to go now. Okay, so that feels already a lot better. Okay, so I think our game is coming along really well, guys. Yep, that is it for now, and I will see you soon.